B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Chov Daled. We're going to start 8 lines from the top of the Omid. Says the Gemara, and we're continuing to learn about the Trumas Hadeshen, separating a little bit of the ashes from the Mizbeach, removing it and placing it next to the Mizbeach on the Mizrach side, a detail we haven't learnt much about yet. And then afterwards they would do the Hoitzoas Hadeshen, they would take the remaining ashes from the top of the Mizbeach and take it outside the city. Says the Gemara, Boyer of Ovin, Trumas Hadeshen Bekamo. What was the minimum amount of ashes that had to be shoveled away, had to be taken away from the top of the Mizbeach for the mitzvah of Trumas Hadeshen? Says the Gemara, what are the two options? Mitrumas Maisi Alfinon Lo? Do we learn it, and do we say that the separation from the Mizbeach is similar to the separation that the Levi takes from the Maisa Rishon that he received, that he takes a tenth and gives it to the Kohen, called Trumas Maisa, which would mean that Truma is defined by a tenth, Yalfinon Lo, and we learn it from there. Or Trumas Midyon, Yalfinon Lo, or do we learn it out from a separation from Midyon, that we see regarding Midyon, that the Pasuk says that they separated a 1 of 500, 500th. The question is, did they have to separate a tenth of the ashes or a 500th of the ashes? Says the Gemara, the truth is neither. There's a third type of truma, and that's where we learn it from. Ne'emar kan, it says in the Pasuk regarding Trumas Hadeshen, it uses the word v'heirim, v'lovash hakoyin michne seivad yilbash, v'lovash hakoyin midoivad u'michne seivad yilbash al basori, v'heirim es hadeshen. It uses the term v'heirim. And there's another pasuk that says regarding the koimetz. The koimetz is a fistful. It's actually less. It's 3 fingers of the fist full of the mincha. It says v'heirim mimenu bekumtzoi, with his koimetz misailes hamincha mishamno, etc. So we learn out from koimetz. How much coals do you need? As much as the kohen, presumably the kohen who's doing the Trumas Hadeshen, that as much as would fit into his koimetz, into 3 fingers of his fist. Ma'al halon bekumtzoi, afkan bekumtzoi. And this is not an exact measure. We know by the koimetz of the mincha, it was an exact measure. We're going to learn about that later on in Shas. It wasn't allowed to be more or less than the 3 fingers full. However, with the coals, the ashes, it certainly wasn't an exact measure, because the only way to measure it exactly would be to actually put your hand into the burning coals and ashes and remove some. And we're clearly not going to ask the Kohen to do that. You cannot put your hand into a pile of coals. So it must be that the minimum measure of ashes they had to take was that amount. But obviously they could take as much as they wanted. Continues the Gemara, Omar Rav, Arba avodos, there are 4 avodos, even though all avodos must be done with a kohen who's not a balmum, whilst he's wearing the big day kohuna, after having done the kiddush yadayim v'raglayim from the kiyor. Those are all requirements. However, there's only 4 avodos where if somebody who's not a kohen does them, then he's actually going to be chayev misa. Arba avodos zor chayev aleim misa. Misa b'dei shamayim. And that is zrika, the throwing of the blood onto the Mizbeach, v'haktorah, and putting onto the Mizbeach whatever needed to be put on the Mizbeach, v'nisuch hamayim, the pouring of the waters, v'nisuch hayayin, and the pouring of the wine. With every korban there would be nisuch hayayin, and over Sukkot they would add, with the korban tomid, they would add nisuch hamayim. Those are the 4 avodas according to Rav. V'Levi Omar, Levi added af Trumas Hadeshen. The separation of the ashes from the top of the Mizbeach, that's also a type of avodah that if it's done by somebody who's not a kohen, he's going to be chayev misa. V'chein Tani Levi b'masnite, when Levi was arranging his brises, he also said af Trumas Hadeshen, that together with the 4 that Rav mentioned, which is Zrika, Haktorah, Nisuch Hamayim, Nisuch Hayayin, the Trumas Hadeshen was also included. My Talmud Rav, what would be the source for Rav to say that only these 4 avodos, a zor who does them is chayev misa, and not if he does the Trumas Hadeshen? T'chsiv, he learns out from a pasuk. It says in the pasuk as follows: Ve'ato you uvonecho itcho, and your sons, that means the Kohen Gadol, the Kohanim, tishmeru es kohunaschem, you should guard your Your kahuna l'chol dvar hamizbeach, for anything to do with the mizbeach, ula mi beis laparoiches, and for anything which is in the kodesh hakodoshim, which is called the beis haparoiches, va'avadetem, and you shall work, you should serve avoidas matono etenes kunaschem, that your work, matana, would literally mean that you're being given permission to serve is a gift to the Kohanim. We'll soon see the Gemara is going to have another translation of the word matana. Ba'avoidas matana etenes kunaschem v'azor hakorev yumos, and that's where the pasuk says that if somebody's not a Kohen who goes and does any of these avodas which are mentioned to or alluded to in this pasuk, is going to be chayiv misa. So the Gemara explains avodas matana. What does it mean, avodas matana? It actually means a service of application, of giving, from the term loses, to give. V'lo avodas siluk, that when you apply something to the mizbeach, then that's when you're going to be chayiv if a zor does it. But any type of avodah which is not applying, it's not giving something, rather it's removing something, there's no chiyuv misa. Since the Trumas Hadeshen is removing some of the ashes from the top of the mizbeach, and therefore it's not called avodas matana, and therefore even if a zor does it, he will not be chayiv misa. And what do we learn from the word va'avadetem? From the word va'avadetem we learn avodah tama. It's got to be a type of service which is a conclusion, it's an ending. It finishes off the avodah. V'lo avodah sheyesh achreo avodah. But a type of avodah which is actually a sequence of avodas, where you do one after the next. We'll soon see some examples of that. But when it's a type of avodah that's done with a sequence, only the end, the final avodah, is the one which is va'avadetem, and is the one that if a zor does it, he'll be chayiv misa. But all those avodas running up to the final avodah, if a zor does it, it's asa, but he will not be chayiv misa. So that's the source for Rav, where Rav learns from avodas matana that Trumas Hadeshen, which is siluk, is not chayiv misa. The Levi, what's Levi? Levi also knows that it says in the pasuk avodas matana. So how can Levi say that even Trumas Hadeshen is included in this pasuk? Rabbi Rachmana l'chol dvar hamizbeach. That he says that from the fact that it says in the pasuk that Tishmur es kunaschem l'chol dvar hamizbeach. Why did they have to say l'kol? For all the dvar hamizbeach, it's coming to include something. What's it coming to include? Even the Trumas Hadeshen, which is a siluk from the mizbeach. V'Rav, what's Rav going to do with the extra word kol? According to Levi, I need the kol for Trumas Hadeshen. According to Rav, who says Trumas Hadeshen is not included in this pasuk, what does he do with Rav? Says the Gemara, Hula asuye sheva hazoyis shebifnim v'sheba metzera. That there are certain avodos that they are as tamo, they are avodos at the end of the line, so to speak, and they are avodos matana, but they're not outside in the azora. They're actually inside the heichal, and examples of those are the 7 hazoyis shebifnim. There are certain korbonos. Rashi mentions some of them. The Par Helam Dover, the Par Mashiach, the Par and Yom Kippur, and the sprinkling of the Metzora from the Shemen, where those are avodos that are done in the Heichal, and since they're done in the Heichal, towards the Heichal, but they are bifnim, avodos of the Heichal, and since they're avodos of the Heichal, we need an extra pasuk to say that, because the pasuk just says Dvar Mizbeach. The Mizbeach was outside in the Azara. How do you know that even if you do those avodos, assuming they conform with avodah tama, and they conform with avodas matana, but they're done not in the Mizbeach or in the Azara, they're done in the Heichal, how do we know that if a Azara does them is chayiv misa? That he learns from l'chol Dvar Mizbeach. Levi, who needs the v'chol to say that Trumas Hadeshen is chayiv, which is a siluk, how does he know that those avodos in the Heichal are also included in this pasuk, and the Zar who does them is chayiv? Nafkalemi dvar v'chol dvar. It doesn't only say dvar hamizbeach; it says l'chol dvar hamizbeach. And the truth is, it could have said neither. It could have said tishmur es kunaschem lemizbeach. I don't know exactly what the pasuk could have said, but we don't need the dvar and the kol dvar. So Levi therefore learns 2 things from there. He learns from the dvar he learns even the siluk, the Trumas Hadeshen, and from the V'chol Davar, the extra V'chol, he learns like Rav does, that he learns from there for the, even in the Heichal, a Zor who does them is Chayev Misa. V'Rav, what's Rav going to do with the extra word, not only V'chol, but the V'chol Davar? Says the Gemara, Dvar, V'chol Davar, Loi Dorish. Rav held it was not a type of drasha, it was not a type of word that needed to be learnt from. Continues the Gemara, and the Gemara is now asking a question against Levi. We saw that Levi said that even the Trumas Hadeshen, which is a siluk, nonetheless, if a Zor does it, he's chayev. And where does he learn it from? He learns out from L'chol Davar HaMizbeach. Asks the Gemara, V'eima L'chol Davar HaMizbeach klal. Maybe the Kol Davar HaMizbeach is a generalization that any avodah to do with the Mizbeach, and indeed that would include even the siluk. But what does it say afterwards? Avodas Matono. Avodas Matono is a prat, it's a specification, it's only a service of application, not a service of removal. And this would be a typical klal uprat. Klal uprat, ein bechlal ele masha beprat. The rule is that when you have a specification which is mentioned after a generalization, that we assume that what the Torah meant with the generalization is only things which are similar to the specification, which avodas matona in, avodas siluk loy, that only a type of avodah which is application, if a Zor does it, will be chayev, and not an avodah which is removal. And if so, we have a question, what's your source, Levi, to say that Trumas Hadeshen, if a Zor does it, he'll be chayev misa? Says the Gemara Omar Kro. You have to read the Pasuk and understand the Pasuk as follows. What does it say in the Pasuk? It says, L'chol Davar HaMizbeach, Ulami Beis LaPareiches. Before saying, V'avadetem avodas matono, what does it say? It says, Ulami Beis LaPareiches, V'avadetem. So what do we see from there? That El Mibeis LaPareiches, that only in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Hu de avodas matona v'lo avodas siluk. You're right that from the words avodas matona, you only know, like we said before, you only know a service of application that the Zor is chayiv misa and not siluk. But when is that true? Only mibeis lapareiches avodas that are done in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. However, and there we say avodas matona v'lo avodas siluk, but we deduce from the pasuk ha b'chutz, but outside, in the Azara, where the Mizbeach is, afilu avodah siluk. So it's as if the Pasuk is telling us explicitly that this limitation of the Hazara Korev Yumos, which is only avodas matona and not avodah siluk, is only correct, or that's only the halacha in the Kodesh Kadoshim, not outside. And therefore, Levi has a good source to say that for the work outside, by the Mizbeach, we don't have this limitation, and therefore, even Trumas Hadeshen, he'll be chayiv. Asks the Gemara, Ihochi, if so, just in the same way as the word avodas matona is after the words Olimi Beis LaPareiches, and we said just now that avodas matona is only a limitation in the Beis LaPareiches, in the Kodesh Kadoshim, and not in the Azara. So maybe the word va'avadetem, which tells us that it's got to be an avodah tamo, an ending avodah, is also only in the Kodesh Kadoshim, but outside, even an avodah which is not an avodah tamo, he'll also be chayev if a Zor does it. Yehocha va'avadetem nami el mibeis lapareiches huda avodah tamo, only in the Kodesh Kadoshim it needs to be an avodah tamo. For example, putting the ktoires on Yom Kippur onto the fire, onto the coals. V'lo avodah sheyesh achreo avodah. And not a type of avodah which is a part of a string of avodas. For example, bringing the spoon of the coals or the ktoires into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, sheyesh achrei avodah, which has after it an avodah, which is to pour the ktoires into his hands, into his fists, and then from his fists he's got to put it onto the coals. Those avodas not. Ha b'chutz, but outside in the Azara, afilu avodah sheyesh achrei avodah, maybe one Azara will be chayiv misa even if he does an avodah which is not avodah tamo. Says the Gemara, no, because the difference between avodas matono and the avodah tamo is that avodas matono is learned from the word avodas matono. Where do we learn avodah tamo from? It's got to be the last avoida in the line from va'avadetem, the extra vov. So from the extra vov, hodar orvei kro, it links it back to what it said before. What does it say before? It says v'ato ovnecho itcha tishmeru es kunaschem l'chol dvar hamizbeach. And then it says ulami beis laparoiches. Not only the dvar hamizbeach in the Azara, also what's going on in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Va'avadetem. Va'avadetem is va means going back not only on the Kodesh Kadoshim but also on the Dvar HaMizbeach. It has to be a avoida tamo, an ending, a completing avoida. And then avoidas matana, it doesn't say avov. Because to say that avoidas matana is only a restriction, that it's got to be avoidas matana, not avoidas siluk, that's going exclusively on the words, l'mibeis lapareches, which is only inside the Kodesh Kadoshim and not outside in the Azara. And that is how Levi is going to learn this pasuk. Asks the Gemara, Boya Rava. Rava now has an interesting question, and it's a question with Levi. That what did Levi say? Levi said that even avoida siluk, like Trumas Hadeshen in the Azara, is Azar who does it is chayev. He learns it out from L'chol Dvar HaMizbeach. However, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, we just said now, if you do it in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there we say no. There we say avoidas matana. That in the Beis Laparoiches, the avoidas matana, only in a service of application, the Zor will be chayev, not siluk. So we have the Azara, where Levi says avoidas siluk is chayev. We have the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that avoidas siluk is not chayev. We have an area in between, called the Heichal. What about those avoidas? The avoidas done in the Heichal, do we say they are similar to the Azara, and avoidas siluk will be chayev, if Azara does it? Or do we say that the Heichal is similar to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to the Beis Laparoiches, and avoidas siluk will not be chayev misa? That was Rava's question. Boy Rava. And the truth is, before Rava asked his question, we could almost be forgiven to assume that a Zor who does any avoida in the Heichal is not going to be chayev misa. Read the pasuk. The pasuk speaks about the Dvar HaMizbeach, which is in the Azara, and the Gemara speaks about the Beis Laparoiches, and the pasuk speaks about the Beis Laparoiches, which is in Kodesh HaKadoshim. But maybe if he does any avoida, even if it's avoida tamo, and even if it's an avoidas matana in the Heichal, who says he's chayev? But Rav is clearly assuming not that way, and he's assuming that it's clear that in the Heichal, if a Zor does those avoidas, which are also avoida tamo, and also avoidas matana, of course he's going to be chayev misa. The question is, regarding siluk, where there's a difference between the Kodesh Kadoshim, where he's not chayev misa, and the Azara, where he is chayev misa, where do we put the Heichal? That was Rava's question. Avoida siluk, beheichal mahu. It's obviously only a question according to Levi. According to Rav, avoida siluk is never chayev, even by the Mizbeach. He says Trumas Hadeshen is not going to be chayev misa. So do we say that it's lefonim medaminon lei? We compare the Heichal to the Kodesh HaKadoshim, to the Beis Laparoiches, and by siluk, avoida siluk will be potur. Do we compare it to the Azara, and we say avoida siluk will be chayev? Hodar Poshta, after Rava asked the question, Rava himself resolved it. Mi beis, ula mi beis. He could have just said, L'chol Dvar HaMizbeach, mi beis laparoiches, from the Kodesh HaKadoshim. What's ula mi beis laparoiches? These extra letters are teaching us not only the Kodesh HaKadoshim proper, but even the Heichal, which is the area just before adjacent to the Kodesh Kadoshim. There too it has the same halachas as the Kodesh Kadoshim, that a Zor who does an avodah of siluk will not be chayev misa. Elo me'ato. But now that we understand that if you do an avodas matono, which is also an avodah tamo, in the Heichal, you are chayev misa. If so, we have a question. Why did Rav and Levi didn't argue with that? Say that there's 4 things and only 4 avodos that a Zor who does them is chayev misa. Levi adds on 1 more, which is Trumas Hadeshen. But if you say that the avodos in the Heichal, assuming that they are avodas matona and vavadetem and avodah tamo, that they're chayev misa, we've got some more. Zor shesider es hashulchan. What happens if a Zor, somebody who's not a Kohen, places the breads onto the shulchan in the Heichal? On Shabbos, they would bring new breads. They would remove the breads of the previous week. They would put new breads. If a Zor does that, he should be chayev. He should be chayev. So why then does Rav not say that there's only 4 avodas? There's another one. There's the Sidur HaShulchan. Says the Gemara, you know why? Because it's not an avodah tama. It's not the end of the line. There's something you do after arranging the breads. What is that? Ika sidur bezichin. You have to place the spoons onto the shulchan. The spoons with the levaina, with those spices that are going to be put on the mizbeach the following Shabbos. And since it's not an avodah tama, therefore he won't be chayev. Therefore Rav didn't mention them. So the Gemara says, okay, sidur bezichin chayev. What happens if a zar puts the spoons onto the shulchan, the spoons with the levaina? Maybe he should be chayev. Says the Gemara, no, because that's also not the end. Ika siluk, there's the taking away the spoons, taking away the levaina, v'aktara, and putting the levaina onto the mizbeach. So therefore the arranging and putting the spoons onto the shulchan is not the end of the line. You're going to ask me a question, what happens if a zar actually does the end of the avodah of the levaina by putting those spoons, the levaina of those spoons, onto the mizbeach? He should be chayev because it's the end of the line. The answer is, he is chayev. You can ask me a question, why didn't Rav say it? He did. Rav said haktoris, that putting anything onto the mizbeach. He didn't say only a korban. He didn't say only the emurim and the fats. It includes the bezichin. And the levaina in the bezichin is also included in that, and indeed, Rav mentioned it. Continues the Gemara. Zor shesideres hamenoira. We're still talking about the heichal. We're looking for an avodah tama and an avodas matona in the heichal that zor should be chayev, and Rav didn't mention it. Says yes. How did they used to clean the menorah? They would remove the lamps at the top, clean them out, and then put the lamps back into the menorah. So the person who was masadir, who arranged and replaced those lamps every day after cleaning them onto the menorah, it was in the heichal. It seems to be an avodah tama. It's an avodah not of siluk. It's not like the dishun taking away the ashes, which is an avodah siluk. It's after it's cleaned, you're replacing the lamps on top of the menorah. He should be chayev. It's matana. It seems to be avodah tama, and he should be chayev. Says the Gemara, no, because that's not the end of the avodah. Ikanesinas psila. Because after you return those lamps, you actually have to insert the wicks. So therefore, rearranging and replacing the lamps in and of its own is not an avodah tama. Says the Gemara, okay, nosan psila lechayev. If a zar puts the wicks into the lamps, he should be chayev. It's an avodah tama. Says the Gemara, it's still not an avodah tama. Ikanesinas shemen. After you put the wicks there, you have to put the oil there. Says the Gemara, nosan shemen lechayev. If a zar puts the oil in, he should be chayev. It's avodah tama. Why does Rav not mention it? Says the Gemara, because it's still not the end. Ikahad loka, because he's got to light the menorah. Hidlik lechayev. You're going to ask, what's with the zar actually lights the menorah? He should be chayev. And if he's and there's nothing after lighting the menorah, that's it. It's avodah tama, and it's not an avodah siluk. So why does Rav not mention it? Says the Gemara, a very interesting and cryptic 4 words, hadloka lav avodahi. That the kindling of the menorah is insignificant. All you're doing is putting a match, or just putting a fire to a wick. That's not a significant enough type of avodah that if a zar does it, he's going to be chayev misa. And then the Rishonim here all discuss, if hadloka is not an avodah, then the end of the avodah is putting in the oil. He should be chayev. Or the Rishonim may discuss what's going on here. But either way, that's what the Gemara says. Anything before the hadlaka is not avodah tama. The final thing, what makes it avodah tama, is an insignificant act which would not warrant a chiyuv misa. Says the Gemara, v'loi, and kindling is not significant enough that if a zar does it, he should be chayiv misa. V'otani, we learned in a brisa. The pasuk says, "V'nosnu bnei Aaron hakohen eish ala mizbeach," that the kohanim, with the sons of Aaron, the kohanim, they would put fire on the mizbeach, v'orchu eitzim alo eish, and they would arrange the woods on the fire. What do we learn from there? That if the fire on the mizbeach, on the top of the mizbeach, was dying down, and you had to rekindle it, what would they do? That they would take some aliso, some wooden chips, which were lying on the side, and put it onto the fireplace, and with that they would reignite the flame and the fire on top of the mizbeach. And that's what you learn from this pasuk. V'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish ala mizbeach, that this should be done exclusively by the b'nei Aaron. So limeid that teaches us al hatzosas elisa, the kindling of these chips, sheloi tehei elo b'kohen kosher, it should only be done with a kosher kohen, not with a balmum, ubekli shoris, when he's wearing his big day kahuna. So you see that it's a significant, it's called an avodah, and it has to be done exclusively by a kohen. So why are you saying that just lighting the menorah, kindling the menorah, is not considered a significant avodah? Here you see that kindling the mizbeach is considered significant, and it has to be done by a kohen with the klei shoris. Says the Gemara, there's a fundamental difference between kindling the mizbeach and kindling the menorah. Hatzosas elisa avodahi, hadloka lav avodahi. There's a difference between kindling the mizbeach, that is very significant. However, lighting the menorah, which is not the mizbeach, is much less significant. Now, just for the sake of clarity, what have we had so far? We've had a discussion, and we've said that to be chayiv misa, if a zor does an avodah, it has to be an avodah tamo, and it has to be an avodas matona. And we said that that's machleikas Rav and Levi, whether that's even in the Azorah. And then the Gemara asked a number of questions. What's within the Heichal? And we said that it would seem from Rava that in the Heichal, even if, at least if it's not Siluk, if it's Avodas Matona, if it's an Avodah Tamo, he'll be Chayiv. And we asked from Sidur HaShulchan and Sidur HaMenorah. And the way we resolved the Sidur HaMenorah is by saying that Hadloka Lav Avodahi, which means there's a third condition. Before being an Avodah Tamo, and before being an Avodas Matona, it has to be an Avodah. Hadlok is not considered an Avodah at all. And then the Gemara sort of digressed and said that from a Brisa we see that arranging and lighting the Mizbeach is considered an Avodah. And there's a fundamental difference between the two, because lighting the Mizbeach, when, at least in the morning when the Mizbeach needed to be lit, then it's clear that lighting the Mizbeach, it's not an Avodah Tamo at all. So we're not discussing there whether Zor who does it is Chayiv Misa. All we're discussing, is it an Avodah, is it not? So how can you say that kindling the menorah is not an Avodah? You see clearly from the fact that it needs to be done by a Kohen, and with his big day kahuna, you see that it's an Avodah, the lighting the Mizbeach. So then how can you say that lighting the menorah is not considered an Avodah? And the Gemara says there's a difference between them, that even though lighting the Mizbeach is considered an Avodah, lighting the menorah is not considered an Avodah. And then the Rishonim ask, if lighting the menorah is not considered an Avodah, why does a Kohen have to do it? And why does it have to be done with the big day kahuna? And that's the Rishonim discuss that. But that was all in a very focused discussion. Is it called an Avodah? Is it not called an Avodah? And now the Gemara continues. Elo me'ata. And it seems that this question is both according to Rav and according to Levi. That everybody agrees that Avodas Matono, which is an Avodah Tamo, is Chayev, definitely in the Azorah. The Pasuk says, L'chol Devar HaMizbeach. So Elo me'ata. Zor shesider hamarocha. If a Zor, somebody who's not a Kohen, arranges the fire on the Mizbeach, L'chayev, he should be Chayev. Because after that, what do you still have to do after arranging the marocha? It's an avodah tamo. It's arranging, putting the woods there is a avodas matono. It's a avodah tamo. So it should be chayav. So why does Rav say there's just 4 things, which we said before was the zrikos, the aktoris, the nisuch hamayim, and the nisuch hayayin? You've got sidur hamarocha. Says the Gemara, it's not considered an avodah tamo. Ika sidur shnei gizreitzim, because after arranging the woods on the mizbeach, they would bring 2 logs of wood called the shnei gizreitzim, and that would follow the arranging of the mizbeach, and they have to put it on. So the arranging of the mizbeach in and of its own is not an avodah tamo. Says the Gemara, okay, so understand that a Zor who does that won't be Chayev. But if a Zor is Siddur Shnei Gzirin, if the Zor places the 2 Gizreitzim, he should be Chayev. Lechayev, he should be Chayev. Why doesn't Rav mention it? Says the Gemara, because after that, Iker Siddur Eivorim. There's the arranging of the limbs onto the Mizbeach, onto the fire, and those Siddur Eivorim, that comes after the Shnei Gizreitzim. And you're going to ask me a question, if a Zor does the Siddur HaIvorim, the arranging of the limbs by the Mizbeach, he should be Chayev. The answer is Chayev, and Rav mentions it. That's included in when Rav says Haktorah, any Haktoris, even the Siddur of the Ivorim. Says the Gemara of Ha'omer of Asi Omer Rabbi Yechanan. Was it not said in the name of Rabbi Yechanan that Zor Shesider Shnei Gizrei Eitzim Chayev? Do we not see? Does Rabbi Yechanan not say that if a Zor actually arranges the two Gizrei Eitzim, puts the two Gizrei Eitzim onto the fire, he's going to be Chayev? And that's clearly not like Rav, because Rav said there were four things, and Siddur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim was not one of them. But we assume that Rav is not arguing with Rabbi Yechanan, is it called an Avodah Tama, is it not called an Avodah Tama? We assume that Rav had a different reason for arguing with Rabbi Yechanan, but once we see that Rabbi Yechanan says that he's Chayev, so we say, seems to be that Siddur Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is considered an Avodah Tama, and a final Avodah, and Rav's not arguing with that, he's arguing on a different point that we don't know what that would be. But so do we not see from Rabbi Yechanan that the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim is considered an Avodah Tama, not like the Gemara answered before? Says the Gemara, no, that's exactly what Rav and Rabbi Yechanan were arguing about. They were not arguing about something different. They were arguing exactly in this point. And Rav, who did not mention the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, is because Rav held it was not an Avodah Tama. B'har pligi. Marasova Rabbi Yechanan holds Avodah Tamahi, that putting the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, that's the end of the Avodah of preparing the Mizbeach. The Siddur Ivorim are not a continuation of that. Marasova and Rav held Lav Avodah Tamahi. It's not considered a finishing, a final, a completing Avodah, and therefore it's not mentioned. Continues the Gemara. Tanya Kavasei Rav, Tanya Kavasei Levi. We had the machlokes at the beginning on Chof Daled Amud Aleph whether Trumas Hadeshen is, if a Zor does it, is he Chayev Misa or not Chayev Misa? Rav said he's not Chayev Misa. Rav said four things, didn't mention a fifth. And Levi says no. He said the Zor is Chayev Misa even by the Siluk of the Trumas Hadeshen. And we're actually going to have a brisa like both opinions. Tanya Kavasei Rav. We're going to find a brisa that's more or less echoing the four things that Rav said, and Trumas Hadeshen is not mentioned there. Avodos shezor chayev aleim misa. The following are avodos which, if a zor does them, is chayev misa. There's rikas hadam, bein lefonim, bein lifnim, bein lifnai velifnim. And Rashi says this means throwing the blood onto the mizbeach, on the outside mizbeach, and the lifonim is in the mizbeach of the mizbeach hapnimi in the heichal, and the lifnai v'lifnim is the blood that was done on Yom Kippur in the Kodesh Kedoshim. Anything to do with zrikos hadam are all included in zrikos, as Rav mentioned, zrikas hadam and azor is chayev. And this includes hamazeh b'chatos oif. One of the avodos that were done by the chatos oif is sprinkling the blood of the chatos, the bird chatos, on the mizbeach, v'hamematzeh, and squeezing out for those korbonos that one had to do mitzui, v'hamaktir, or if somebody put onto the mizbeach ba'olas ha'oif, the olas ha'oif, that all these things, putting the olas ha'oif on the mizbeach is included in haktoris, all the others are included in the zrikos. V'hamenasech shleisha lugin mayim, as we saw, if somebody pours the 3 lug of water, which came with the carbon tamid, or shleishas lugim yain, or the 3 lug of the wine, which Rav also mentioned, the nisuch hamayim and nisuch hayayin. So this is a brisa that mentions 4 things, and they reflect Rav's opinion, and Trumas Hadeshen is not mentioned there. Tanya Kavasei de Levi. Where do we have a brisa like Levi that seems to say that Trumas Hadeshen will be chayev if a Zor does it? Avodos shezor chayev aleim misa hameirim es hadeshen. It says explicitly that somebody who separates the deshen, the ashes, from the mizbeach, if a zor does it, he's chayev. V'sheva hazois shebefnim v'sheba metzera, and those hazois that were done in the heichal, they also, if a zor does them, is chayev misa. V'amale al gabe mizbeach bein davar kosher bein davar posel, putting, and this is included in haktoris, putting anything on the mizbeach, either something that's allowed to go on the mizbeach or something that's not allowed to go on the mizbeach, but a type of psul that im olu lo yorad, those type of things that you put onto the mizbeach, and when you put them on, you do not take them back off, then that's considered a haktorah, and if a zor does them, he'll be chayev. So in this brisa we see that explicitly that Trumas Hadeshen, if a zor does it, is chayev misa, which is proof to Levi. Continues the Gemara. Lomo mefaisin. We're going back to the pious, to the lots that were made in the Azora. In the meantime, we're busy with the first pious, where they were deciding who was going to do the Trumas Hadeshen. So the Gemara asks, Lama mafaisin, why do you do a piyus? Asks the Gemara, Lama mafaisin, you're asking why? Kuta omron, like the Mishnah says, in order to make sure that there should be no arguing, no pushing. Everybody should know who should do who should do the avodah. Says the Gemara, no, that wasn't the question. Lama mafaisin v'chayzrin umafaisin. Why did they do the 4 piyusin that we're going to learn about? We saw the end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, the last words of the Mishnah was Arba payosis hayusham. There was 4 different times in the day that they would collect, they would gather in the Lishkas Hagozis, we'll learn about that soon, and they would do the payos. Why didn't they just do them once? Once in the morning, do 4 payosos, and that's it. Why were they spread out over the whole day? Omer Rabbi Yochanan said, Kedei lehargish kol azora, because we want to stir an excitement in the azora, that all the Kohanim are getting together. They're going into the Lishkas Hagozis, into the part that has the halacha of Kodesh. We'll soon learn about that. And we want the Azora to get all excited. Shenemer, as it says in the Pasuk, and this is a great honor for Hashem, Asher Yachtov, together, Namtik Soid will take the sweet counsel, Reveis Eloikim, in Hashem's house, Nahalich Barogesh, we're going to walk with excitement. So you see there's an Indian that there should be excitement in the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, in order there should be an excitement, they would do the payos at 4 different times in the day. Continues the Gemara. Which clothes did the Kohanim who did the piyos? And let's assume we're talking about the first payos. Early in the morning, they were doing a payos. Who's going to do the Trumas Hadeshen? Whoever's going to do the Trumas Hadeshen is certainly going to have to wear the Bigdei Kahuna to do the Trumas Hadeshen. But did they wear the Bigdei Kahuna before doing the lot, before doing the payos? Let's say there were 50 Kohanim who wanted to do the Trumas Hadeshen, only one would do it. Did all 50 change from their regular clothes to the Bigdei Kahuna, do the payos? The lucky one who won would do the Trumas Hadeshen, and all the rest would take off the Bigdei Kahuna. They didn't win the lottery. So that's the question. And so Machlekes HaMeroim, Rav Nachman Omar b'Bigdei Chol, Rav Nachman says that they did the lottery in Bigdei Chol. The lottery in and of its own is not an avodah. You don't need to wear Bigdei Kahuna. Rav Sheshes Omar, Rav Sheshes says no, the Bigdei Kodesh. Even though he, of course, Rav Sheshes agrees that doing the lots, doing the payos is not an avodah, but he says nonetheless, we'll soon see why, make sure that any Kohen who's joining this payos, make sure that they're wearing the Bigdei Kodesh. Rav Nachman Omar b'Bigdei Chol. Why did Rav Nachman insist that they would not wear the Bigdei Kodesh? Di Omr's Bigdei Kodesh, if you're going to say they're all going to be wearing their Bigdei Kodesh, Ikabal Israel, you'll have those ruffians, those bullies, those ruffians, the Chamsi V'Ovda, that they're going to force their way to do the Avodah. Everybody's getting changed into Bigdei Kahuna. They're not going to wait for the payos, or they will just disregard the outcome of the payos, and they'll just go into the Trumas Hadeshen. He's wearing the 4 clothes anyway. And therefore we say, no. Nobody puts on any Bigdei Kahuna. We'll do the payos, and the one that wins will put on the Bigdei Kahuna, and he'll do it, leaving no space for the other people to quickly run and do the Avodah. Rav Sheshes Amar, Rav Sheshes argued and said, Bigdei Kodesh. We want everybody to be wearing the Bigdei Kodesh, Di Omr's Bigdei Chol, because if everybody will be wearing their regular clothes, Agav Chavivuse, it could be that there'll be a Kohen. The Kohen who will win the lottery will be so passionate and so excited to do the Trumas Hadeshen that Mikra V'Ovda accidentally is going to go and run up to do the Trumas Hadeshen. He just won the lottery. He's not going to remember that he has to first change into Bigdei Kahuna. And therefore, Rav Sheshes says, be safe. Everybody should wear the Bigdei Kahuna, and the one who wins can then immediately go and do the Trumas Hadeshen. Continues the Gemara. Omer of Nachman, Minoa Minala. What would be my source, says Rav Nachman, that they would do the payos with Bigdei Chol? Did none, because we learned in a Mishnah in Masechet Tomid that Mosrun lechazonim, after they did the payos, then all the Kohen who won would be handed over to the chazonim, to the attendants, and the attendants, they would help the Kohen to remove all the clothes he was wearing, and they would only leave on him his trousers, because obviously it's immodest that the Kohen should be totally stripped, so they would leave the trousers on him. And this is quite cryptic. We have to understand, what does this mean? I mean, he's got to change and take off the trousers of the weekday trousers and put on the Kodesh trousers. But we know he was also wearing a tunic. He was wearing clothes that would have covered himself had he taken off his trousers. The question is, what's going on here? That this that this kohen who'd won the lottery, that they would take off all his clothes and they would only leave on him the michnasayim. What's going on? So the Gemara is explaining, my love, can we not take it for granted that ba'oison shezachu lepayas? We're talking about the one, as I explained, we're talking about the one that had won the payas. And what was he doing? This is Rav Nachman bringing proof. So the only way to understand this Mishnah so far is that everybody was wearing their weekday clothes. The one person that won the payas, they would take off all their weekday clothes and they would leave on their weekday, the regular trousers. They would wear all the other big day kahuna, and now that they're totally covered over with the tunic, with the rest of their bodies are now wearing the big day kahuna, now they could take off from underneath, and there's no issue of modesty here because he's totally covered over. He'll take off the michnasayim, he'll slip them off from underneath the weekday michnasayim, put on the kodesh michnasayim, and now he'll have all the 4 big day kahuna on. That's how Rav Nachman understood this Mishnah. However, Omer of Huna bar Yehuda, Omer of Sheshes, it was said in the name of Rav Sheshes, no, this very Mishnah is not talking about helping the person who won the payas take off the weekday clothes and put the regular clothes and put on his big day kahuna. It's talking about for those who did not win the payas. And this is Rav Sheshes talking, which means that all the people there were wearing big day kahuna. That's what Rav Sheshes himself said. Rav Sheshes says, we're big day kodesh. All the kohanim were wearing the big day kodesh. And now, all those that didn't win the payas, they have to remove their big day kodesh. So what did they do? They removed all the clothes besides for the michnasayim. They put on the big day choil, and after they were wearing the big day choil, they would remove the michnasayim of kodesh and put on the michnasayim of choil. That's how Rav Sheshes was going to understand that Mishnah. And Hochinami Mistaber, he's going to bring proof to that, in that he's going to even say that it's almost impossible to learn that Mishnah like Rav Nachman did. Because how did Rav Nachman learn the Mishnah? Rav Nachman learned it was talking about the person that won the payas. And Rav Nachman holds that they were wearing big day choil. So according to Rav Nachman, how's he reading the Mishnah? That they would remove all the big day choil besides for the michnasayim. They would put on the big day kodesh, obviously besides for the michnasayim, and then after all that was done, they would remove the michnasayim of choil and put on the michnasayim of kodesh. That's how Rav Nachman learnt the Mishnah, which would mean that the last clothes of the big day kodesh that this kohen was going to put on was the michnasayim. And we have an issue with that, because we know that the michnasayim is not the last clothes that's put on, it's got to be the first one that's put on. According to you, Rav Nachman, that they were wearing the big day choil, and the Mishnah is talking about helping this one person who won the payas, and that's if it's the first payas, it's that one who won it. And later on we'll see that there's some payases with a number of winners, but if it's helping them put on the big day kahuna, then the Mishnah would mean that you leave the michnasayim of choil on him until he's put on the other big day kahuna. Votani, we learned in a brayso. So we mentioned this already on Daf Yomi Shiur base. That how do we know that the first of the big day kahuna that have to be put on has to be the michnasayim? Talmud Leima, we learn this out from the pasuk. The pasuk says, bad yiyu al basari, that the first of the big day kahuna that have to go onto his flesh, onto his body, has to be the michnasayim. So how can you, Rav Nachman, understand this Mishnah? Asks the Gemara, indeed, how's Rav Nachman understanding this Mishnah? If Rav Nachman says that they were all wearing big day choil, and this Mishnah is telling us how they're going to switch from big day choil to big day kodesh, indeed, how can you say it's contrary to that brayso? Answers the Gemara, Rav Nachman's got an answer. This is how you have to understand the Mishnah. Ad she'oidon alein big day choil malbishin oison michnasei kodesh. It means that there's a stage which the Mishnah left out. That means with this winner, the one who we are now going to change from big day choil to big day kodesh, first and foremost he removes the michnasayim of choil. He's otherwise covered with the other garments. He removes the michnasayim of kodesh and puts on the michnasayim of kodesh. And that's even before he puts on anything of choil. And then, after he's wearing michnasayim of kodesh, then they would help him remove all his other clothes. Which ones? The bigdei chol. And all they would leave on him is elo michnasayim bilvad. They would leave the michnasayim because he's wearing michnasayim of kodesh. You don't remove those, he's about to do the Trumas Hadeshen. You leave on the michnasayim you put on first, and then you put on the other bigdei kahuna, and that's how Rav Nachman will understand this Mishnah. Omer of Sheshes. Now it's Rav Sheshes' turn to find a proof that, to his opinion, that they would wear, whilst doing the payas, they would wear bigdei kodesh. Omer of Sheshes, Minoa Minelo. The Tanya, I've got another brisa, Tosefta. What does it say in the Tosefta? Lishkas Hagozis. This Lishka, which was in the Mizrach Tzofin of the Azara, there was a chamber there called Agozis. It was hewn out of stone. Lishkas Agozis, Kamin Besilki Gedoyloi, so it was a very tall building. And what would be in there? Payas b'Mizracha. On the Mizrach side of that Lishkas Agozis, they would do the payas. V'zokin Yeshiv b'Marova, and on the Ma'ariv side of the Lishkas Agozis, an elder would sit there and he would teach them and make sure, he would direct the payas. And the Kohanim, they would stand in a circle, kamin b'chulya, like a circular ornament called a kulyar. They would stand in a circle. And the person who's arranging this, who's doing the payas, would come. He would remove the hat from one of the Kohanim, and then they would know that shemimenu payas maschil. From there, the payas was starting. He would say a number, and then they would put up their fingers, and they would go round until the number falls on the person who's the person who won the lottery. That's what it says in the Tosefta. Says the Gemara, says of Sheishes, V'isal kedaitach b'bigdei chol. If you're going to say that the Kohanim are wearing the bigdei chol, the regular garments, whilst doing the payas, mitznefes b'bigdei kuhuna, b'bigdei chol meika, you said that they would remove the mitznefes, the hat. The hat is one of the bigdei kuhuna. And that they would remove it from the kohen that they were starting to do the payas from. Well, if he's not wearing bigdei kodesh, where's the mitznefes coming from? Says the Gemara, that's not a proof. And this is, Rav Nachman would refute this and say no. There is a concept of a mitznefes, even though they're wearing bigdei chol. What would that be? Kedetanu of Yehuda v'Tamir of Shmuel bar Yehuda. Kohen she'asa le'imay ksoines. Normally we know that the bigdei kahuna have to come from the tzibur. They have to belong to the tzibur. However, a mother of a kohen who wanted to show her pride, wanted to show her abilities in making bigdei kahuna, and whatever she wanted to express, she was allowed to make for her son, the kohen, the ksoines, the tunic, an ovid ba'avodas yochid, even though he's not allowed to do a type of avodah, which is the avodas tzibur, like the korban tomid and other avodas, but avodas yochid, he was allowed to do with it. Now, even though these begodim, which what we just mentioned now is the ksoines, the tunic, and we're saying that the same would apply with the hat, it had to be donated to the Beis HaMikdash, in which case it did have the status of bigdei kodesh. However, these bigdei kodesh, Rav Nachman was okay with. What did Rav Nachman say before? Rav Nachman says they would have to wear bigdei chol. Why would they have to wear bigdei chol? Because we're afraid if they're wearing bigdei kodesh, then the balis royes, the ruffians, will quickly come and do the avodah, even though they have not won the lottery. But that's only true if they would be wearing the regular bigdei kodesh, which allowed them to do even avodas tzibur. Because that's what the payas was for the Trumas Hadeshen. It's an avodas tzibur. The korban tomid is avodas tzibur. However, so Rav Nachman agrees that those begodim, those bigdei kodesh, that were only allowed to be used for avodas yochid, they were allowed to use those. They were allowed to wear those whilst doing the payas. So this Tosefta that we just saw now, that they would do the payas, they would remove the mitznefes. The mitznefes is the term used for one of the bigdei kahuna. Yes, because it was common that Kohanim had bigdei kahuna, which included a mitznefes, even though they could not be used for avodas rabim. They could only be used for avodas yochid, not for avodas tzibur, and therefore the kohen was wearing that, and therefore that's how Rav Nachman is going to explain this Tosefta. Continues the Gemara, Omar Rabbi, Shma mina. From this brisa, this Tosefta we just learnt now, we learned that the Tosefta told us that they would go into the Lishkas Hagozis, and the Lishkas Hagozis, on the Mizrach side, they would do the payas, and on the Ma'ariv side, there would be an elder that was sitting there. They would be standing in a circle, etc. From all that Tosefta, what do we see? Two things. Number one, Lishkas Hagozis Chetzio b'Kodesh v'Chetzio b'Chol. We know it must be that half of the Azora, half of the Lishkas Hagozis, is Kodesh. The Dorim side of the Lishkas Hagozis is Kodesh, and which has that status Nalochas of the Azora. And then there's the side towards the Tzofin, which is where the wall of the Azora is, and or beyond it. And that part of the Lishkas Hagozis is considered Chol, does not have the status of Azora. Ushma mina, what else do we see from there? That Shnei Psachim Hayula, there were two entrances into the Lishkas Hagozis. Echad Pasuach b'Kodesh, ve'echad Pasuach b'Chol. There were two ways of getting into the Lishkas Hagozis, one from the side that was Kodesh, and one from the side that was Chol. And now we're going to explain where we learn these two things from that Tosefta. The Yisol Kedaitach, if you're going to say Kulei b'Kodesh, this is now addressing the first point that Abaya said, that the Lishkas Hagozis must have been half Kodesh, half Chol. Because if it was completely Kodesh, then how can you say Zokin Yoshev b'Marova, that on the Ma'ariv side of the Lishkas Hagozis, the elder was sitting there. V'omar Mar, did we not learn? We're going to learn about this later. Ein yeshiva ba'azora. You're not allowed to sit in the Azora. Elo lemalchus beis David bilvad. Only for the descendants of the dynasty of David, for the Malchus, only for the kings of the dynasty of David HaMelech. So how could this elder be sitting in the Azora, in the Lishkas Hagozis? So it must be that part of the Lishkas Hagozis definitely was Chol. V'yisal kedaitach kula b'Chol. Are you going to say that the whole Lishkas Hagozis was Chol? Payas b'Mizracha. We said that on the Mizrach side of the Lishkas Hagozis, that's where they did the Payas. And what did we say before? Why did they do the Payas 4 times a day? Because Beveis Elokim Nahalech Barogesh, in Hashem's home, we want excitement. Beis Elokim is referring to the Azora. If it's all Chol, then you're not doing the Payas in a place of Beveis Elokim. Eloshma mino, it must be Chetzia b'Kodesh v'Chetzia b'Chol. Part of it was Kodesh and part of it was Chol. That's regarding the first halacha of Abaya. V'yisal kedaitoch Pesach echad yesh. Are you going to say that maybe there was only one entrance into the Lishkas Hagozis, not two? Then if you're going to say Pasuach leKodesh, if you're going to say that the entrance into the Lishkas Hagozis was in the Kodesh, was towards the Azora, Zokin Yoshev b'Marova, how can this elder sit on the Ma'ariv side, on the western side of the Lishkas Hagozis? Votnan, we said before, he's sitting on the part of the Lishkas Hagozis that was Chol. But that doesn't help. Votnan, we learned in the Mishnah that Halishka is Habnuya is B'Chol, even those chambers that are built in the Chol side, Upsucha is leKodesh, but if their openings are in the Azora, Toichon Kodesh, the inside of those chambers have the status of Kodesh. How can the elder sit there? V'yisal kedaitach Pasuach leChol. Are you going to suggest that the entrance was in the Chol part? Then Payas b'Mizrach, how can you say that they did the Payas in the Mizrach if the only entrance that was into the Lishkas Hagozis was into the Chol? Votnan, we learnt in the Mishnah. B'nuyes b'Kodesh, even those chambers that are built in the Kodesh, in the Azora. Upsucha is leChol, but the only entrance into them is Chol, is outside the Azora. Toichon Chol. The inside is considered Chol, not Kodesh. And again, we have the issue, if so, it's not Beveis Elokim Lahalech Barogesh. So it must be Elolav Shma Minor Shnei Psachim Hayula. It must be there were 2 halves and 2 entrances. Echad Pasuach b'Kodesh. There was one side that was open to the Kodesh, and that's where they did the Payas, and that was the Beveis Elokim Nahalech Barogesh. Ve'echad Pasuach leChol. The other side was open to the Chol, and that's where the elder would be able to sit on that side. And that's how Abaya explained what he'd learnt. And in Yitzchok in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.